talk about long night Bella moon and be heavy noisy. All get the mama go long housey. Suppose you think you to Bella moon. No can wait it. Time beginning come out.
So, welcome to CoCo Conversations. This is a new initiative we've taken to highlight and draw attention to fascinating and cutting edge research published with the journal Cooperation and Conflict. And today we are to discuss the newly published special issue on Emplaced Security, which brings together a number of fascinating scholars doing important research, and they all discuss space and place in relation to peace and conflict and to security. And what I think they do in this special issue is problematizing and perhaps also contributing to the spatial turn in IR. And joining me today, all the way from Australia, are the guest editors and also two of the two authors of individual articles in the special issue, Associate Professors Morgan Brigg and Nicole George. I can hope you're waving. They are at the School of Political Science and International Studies, the University of Queensland, Australia. And Nicole's research is focused on gendered politics of conflict and peace building. She focuses on violence, security, and participation. And since the early 2000s, she has conducted research in Fiji, New Caledonia, Bougainville, and the Solomon Islands. And her co-editor for this special issue is Morgan Brigg. And his research blends theory and practice in examining the interplay of culture, governance, selfhood in conflict resolution, peace building, governance, and international development. And his research develops ways of knowing and working across cultural differences, including by engaging with indigenous political philosophy. And of course, we have also invited Nicolas Lemay-Hébert, who is going to act as a commentator in this roundtable sort of discussion. And Nick is a fellow and director of research at the Department of International Relations at Australian National University. And his research focuses on state building and intervention in Asia Pacific and beyond. And he's particularly interested in local resistance to international intervention and the political economy of interventions. So I think we have a great setup here for this CoCo Conversations, and I'm looking forward to a very stimulating discussion. And as sort of the moderator of this virtual roundtable, I take the opportunity to ask the first question. But I think maybe I should just briefly introduce myself as well. So my name is Annika Björkdahl, and I'm professor of political science at Lund University. And I've been the editor for Cooperation and Conflict for the last 7 years. And I'm very proud to present this new initiative, actually. So I'm looking forward to the discussion. So first of all, I'm curious, Morgan and Nicole, what are your own personal intellectual trajectories that have led you to organize this special issue, put it together, and to research the things that you are researching and the findings that you present in the two articles that you have written for the special issue? So maybe I should start by asking you, Nicole, and then move over to Morgan.
Sure, thank you, Annika. Just before I start, I'd just like to acknowledge that we're speaking today, Morgan and I, from the beautiful lands of the Yagara and Turrbal people, and just want to pay our respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and recognizing, of course, that this land was never ceded, the land that we work and live on. The intellectual trajectory of our special issue, I think maybe, is it all right if I answer this personally, and then Morgan could say what he thought about the intellectual trajectory? Because I think, you know, we have sort of different intellectual interests, but they came together in a really like exciting and productive way for me personally anyway, working with Morgan. For me, you know, I've been interrogating this local turn for some years now, and inspired very much by your own work, of course, in this area, and thinking about, you know, what does it mean to talk about the local turn from a gender perspective? And, you know, what is, if we do that and we, you know, if we talk about the importance of engaging with the local and we don't think about gender, what do we miss, and how can the local, you know, sort of perpetuate its own kind of hegemonies and hierarchies and silences and violences. So those kind of questions have been really at the forefront of a lot of the work I've been doing over the last few years. But then, you know, working in the kinds of places that I do, I started to think about the local also as a physical place and a physical space that people are really, that is part of their identity, that they have a deep ontological connection to. And so, you know, for as much as sometimes I think, you know, and certainly in my own work, I felt I was sort of too heavily invested in the politics and the power is constructed, and I was forgetting about the ontological. And so for me, thinking about place and a kind of ontological connection to place and what it means for women if we question that, and the harms that they might feel if we question that, that was sort of the kind of the, how can I put it, the moment where I started to think there's something else I want to say about the local, and maybe the literature on space and on scale might help me do that. So that was the start of my little sort of intellectual journey. But, and I've learned a lot about questioning my own perception of the local from talking to Morgan and other people in our corridors. So, you know, Morgan's someone who works deeply on systems of Indigenous knowledge as well. So I've learned a lot from him and started to question some of my own assumptions a little bit. So anyway, but I don't want to preempt what Morgan's going to say.
Thank you, Nicole. I think this is a really fascinating journey that you've taken, and you bring so much to this in terms of, you know, putting the gender glasses on, and what do we see, and what can that help us question, right? I mean, I think this is really a much needed approach.
Thank you.
So I would like to hear what Morgan is thinking about his own trajectory.
Yes, thanks very much, Annika, and thanks, Nicole, for the acknowledgement and reflection on how our paths cross over. And for me, there are two elements in my intellectual trajectory that feed into this particular special issue. And the first one overlaps with what Nicole had to say, in the sense that we've seen this explosion of interest in the so-called local, ideas of hybrid peace building and so on. And while I haven't contributed particularly to the hybrid peace building literature myself, I engage very much with communities at a grassroots level and have engaged in similar kinds of points. And it's probably worthwhile saying here that there's so much confusion about what is meant by hybridity or hybrid peace building. But I think we can say it's simply about, in one incarnation at least, turning our attention to what is there and what is happening on the ground in terms of governance and conflict management in many conflict and post-conflict settings. And so that question of hybridity or hybrid political orders obviously has a strong interface with the spatial turn. So when Nicole came to me with this idea, I thought, yes, fantastic. This is something we certainly should be engaging with, putting the hybridity and the local turn in conversation with the spatial turn. So that's one part of the trajectory for me. But the other part is how a lot of the turns that were the regular turns, conceptual turns that we see in international relations and frankly in other parts of social science scholarship, I have a question or a concern about how do those turns engage with the colonial dominance which has flowed out of, big episode of European colonialism that flowed around the globe. how that colonial dominance then transferred over into our knowledge forms. So that it inflects the categories that we use in our knowledge work. The dominant categories we use for thinking about political ordering, for governance, for conflict resolution, for peace building, so on, they're European-derived categories. So because the spatial turn links with the local turn, and therefore to what's going on for diverse peoples around the world, I have had this question in the back of my mind, well, how well is this spatial turn engaging with the politics of knowledge that comes with the way our thinking is inflected with European-derived categories? So they're the two sort of parts of my intellectual trajectory that, come into this special issue.
Thank you. I think that's such a valuable contribution to bring the politics and power of knowledge into this, because it's also about, I guess, emplacing knowledge and thinking about who is producing it, where is it produced, and by whom. So I think this is also something that helps us understand much more about the construction of certain spaces and places. So to me, I'm going to continue that path in my own research, I think, because I find that as well really engaging. If I were to push you on asking you what you see as the main contribution of this special issue, where would you say that the importance of the special issue lays? And if I could start with Morgan this time around. Morgan, what do you think?
Well, I mean, I think the spatial turn makes a really valuable contribution. I think we're short of time, so I won't reprise that here. But I think the main contribution is this idea of emplacement. In one way or another, all the authors, contributors to the special issue, are interested in that. And I think the idea of emplacement just pushes the engagement with place and space a bit further to ask questions about where are people grounded when they're doing their work? Who are they engaging with when they're in the field? Rather than just thinking you can have this disembodied abstract scholar bringing a new innovative category to bear to a new site. I think we're pushing people to think more deeply and thoroughly about what a spatial turn means through this idea of emplacement, or I hope we are, at least.
Thank you. I totally agree. Nicole?
Well, I think the other thing that we really wanted to foreground in the kind of engagements that we had as editors with the authors too was to think about security, like in-place security, and what does it mean for actors on the ground to kind of think about their relational connection to a place and the sense of security that they may derive or insecurity that they may feel in that connection, if I can put it that way, if that connection is disrupted or it's not the kind of connection that they want to have, right? So for me, I was always thinking in the back of my mind about the way the participants in the work that, the study that I wrote up articulated this sense of connection as almost a sense of centeredness, about this is a part of my identity. So in parts of my article, I talk about in-placed identity too. And this idea that, because, it can be easy to romanticize that, but the participants in my work, for example, didn't. They often talked about what they wanted to have as that sense of emplacement, but what the reality was and how that was disturbing to them. And so for me, I think that's quite interesting if we're thinking about peace building then, because, that connection to place is ontological and people have an idea sometimes of what they want it to be. And they can't know peace if that connection isn't sort of something that they're experiencing. So yeah, I hope that makes sense. But that kind of nexus between emplacement and identity and security for me is also, I think, something that comes through really beautifully in some of the papers.
It's a fascinating nexus to look at identity, security, and emplacement, because it sort of grounds these notions in experience and also I think in people's everyday.
In the everyday, very much, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think I've abused my time as a moderator for a while, so I think I should leave the floor to Nick, so he get the opportunity to ask some pertinent questions to sort of probe and investigate further this special issue. So Nick, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Annika, and obviously the journal for the invitation, Nicole and Morgan. I'm really, really happy to be with you and celebrating this special issue. First of all, I would also like to acknowledge the land that we virtually meet here in the Nugawal countries. So I would like to acknowledge and pay my respect to the elders past and present. Let me just start by saying that I think this special issue really makes a crucial contribution, and you've already mentioned it, to the intersection between the spatial turn and the local turn. And so I think in a sense, you're making a great contribution to the spatial turn, but also to the local turn in itself. So if the readers here are, coming from peace and conflict studies in general, I think you'll find something very useful here. Moving beyond, and basically understanding local as obviously a scale of practice, but also a disputed local actor. So I think in local turn, there's been a lot of misunderstanding about what is the local. There's been a lot of conversation about this. And I think that you bring a really nice touch here and a great contribution to this literature. I think also, obviously, you're moving the conversation away from, liberal peace building and its travails a little bit, something that we've covered in extensia in the last 10 years or so, moving beyond and looking really and unraveling a little bit what really happens on the ground, of kind of micro sociological kind of understanding. I think it's really great. I have just a series of questions that just probing you and maybe also helping the listener at home, to kind of get a sense of where you are situating yourself. And the first one is, and it's not meant as a trick question, I have to say, but it's just kind of look at the lexicon that we are using here, because if people are not familiar with the literature or the terms that we use, maybe they're just kind of, they might be a little bit, they might find this difficult to follow, right? So I'm just wondering, there's a number of concepts that are being used in the spatial turn. Notions of space, place, scale, and then you have the emplacement concept. I think that this is probably your biggest contribution is on the emplacement as a concept. I think for me, at least that's my own take. But in space, so I'm just kind of throwing a few definitions here, but it could be it's more than territorial, as you mentioned in your introduction. This is the site where social relations become concrete, and that's Lefebvre. Famous description of this, or Annika's understanding of it as a container for social and political action. Place then is a concept that highlighting the concept of attachment. That's also kind of a nice little touch, Latourian touch here. The effective connection and narratives of place identity. And then again, for instance, Nicole, you're using more kind of John Agnew's definition, I think, in your piece. But I would like to know, how do you see all these concepts coming together, interlinking together, creating this kind of coherent set of knowledge that for you then emplacement brings kind of something to this coherent set of concepts?
Great questions. Please, Nicole and Morgan, who wants to go first?
Could I first go, Nicole? And look,
Please do.
Thanks, Nick. Great question. And it may look like I'm trying to dodge your question here in some ways, because I think one of the things we suffer with a bit is we are, at the current time in our social science work, we're sort of beset by needing to work with a certain type of nominalism, working with just name only, because even if you went into geography and the people who work in incredibly detailed ways about space and place and so on, or into the related philosophical literature, there's no real consensus about about the distinction between space and place and how that relates to scale and so on. So for those people who really like to have a fully ordered universe and a set of terms that cohere and operate the same way across different registers and disciplines and sub-disciplines and so on, I think it's a really hard time I have to say that I don't mind the nominalism. I don't mind the way these terms float around and people find ways of using them in different ways. For instance, in the special issue, Damien Grenfell uses place to refer to a material specific place where people are making those sort of effective connections you talked about, and space refers to these larger, more abstract realms and so on. And when Damien proposed, when I was reading his piece in the issue, fine, that works for me. I can see how it makes sense in relation to the case that he's working on. So for me, I think because our knowledge is quite uncertain about a whole range of things at the moment, we have this kind of challenge of not being able to always know exactly how these fit. But so long as an author or scholar is able to make a good case for how they're using a term in a particular way, and if it doesn't just proliferate or confuse things for no good reason, then I'm pretty relaxed about that. And I think that's what we see in the special issue. So it is an answer, but it doesn't give the kind of modernist certainty. Perhaps I'm a little bit more of a post-structuralist than I ever thought I was, to just say, well, we've got to be relaxed with this stuff. But in any case, that's my response to your question.
Yeah, I mean, I think each author is sort of defining their negotiation of these concepts in a way that, you know, they're interested in the literature, but they're also defining it in a way, I guess, that allows them to progress an argument. You know, I was really interested in reading for this piece, and this was new work for me, I have to admit, to go back to the old debates in feminist geography on scale and actually realize that in some ways we are way behind. You know, we are way behind where these debates were in the early 2000s, where, you know, they were talking about the hegemonies of the global scale and the importance of thinking about the body as a space, right? Think of the home as a political space, the household as a political space. So, you know, I found that really exciting, but also I was sort of a little ashamed that, you know, it's taken us so long for, you know, I think the one thing to say maybe, and it maybe echoes what Morgan has said in a different way, is that I think when we start talking about space, we start working in quite transdisciplinary ways or interdisciplinary ways. And that disrupts the certitude that we want to have a particular way of talking about space, or, you know, if that's what you want is certitude. I'm actually someone who kind of likes incertitude, and I find it's often really creative and sometimes analytically productive to bring in concept. I mean, other people might say it's analytically confused. I did have, you know, a really interesting process through the review. I'll be very honest about this, through the review process for this article, you know, because I think, you know, one of the reviewers very rightly was sort of really pushing me to develop a lot more analytical rigor. And I'm really happy where I landed in the end. But, you know, it was not a straightforward process, because I was trying to bring in new concepts together that, you know, I was working through at the same time as writing. But, you know, I do think it can be really analytically productive. We have to be brave sometimes, but to kind of let go of the certitude, but not everyone's going to be comfortable working that way. But I think we've produced some really interesting and sort of creative reworkings of what is, you know, the work that Annika and her co-authors have already been doing in this area. I think, you know, that's inspired us, and we're trying to extend on that in some ways.
I would like to clarify that I'm not reviewer too in this but just for the record. But
thank you if you were.
No, but I think you know, personally, I think it was a strength of the special issue. The way I've read it, is that it's a non-prescriptive way of, you know, of framing things, and I think that this plays in the strength of, you know, obviously you're following the local knowledges, you know, in the kind of Morgan's way, or, you know, like really following what people seem to tell you, what works for the different places that you're looking at. So I think I mean personally, I don't really mean that as a trick question. It's not to say that it was analytically non-rigorous or something like that. I really like the fact that people were using different definitions, and usually it works pretty well. You know, obviously there was no major clashes between, I think, the different understandings of it, and your notion of emplacement in itself is I think, a great contribution, also at least something I have not really seen elsewhere stated as clearly. I think that also runs through all the pieces. Second question that is not meant as a trick question, but I think the special issue is grounded in strong empirical studies, and you also display, and Morgan mentioned that in his introduction, or one of the questions in response to Annika's question, is that you also display healthy dose of criticisms at the process of knowledge production itself, right? And you are labeling the terms in the literature, you know, as potentially performative tricks that to reproduce dominant knowledges and marginalizing other knowledges. And personally, I thought that this was a really interesting idea. So I think I'm just wondering if, you know, you can tell us a little bit more about the kind of underlying tension here, in a sense, right? That I think comes really clearly in Morgan's piece, but also in the introduction itself. You know, you're kind of committing yourself to a thorough, I think you do mention this, spatial turn, or simply as the other option, there's nothing simple with that really, but connecting your concerns with the concept of relationality and the programmatic concerns of diverse people that you encounter. So moving away from the spatial turn as an object, let's say, or as the turn, you know, but more going into, you know, really what people telling you and the diversity of voices that you meet on the ground, you know. I think Morgan's in your piece, you have a really nice way of putting this as, you know, the logic of conceptual turns as it has been done over the years. At least it represents a disconnect from other forms of knowledge. And Anne Brown in one of her pieces in your special issue also shows how this spatial turn is reified, reproducing problematic epistemological relations. So I'm just wondering if you can tell us more, tell the, you know, the listeners at home a little bit more about, you know, where we stand here. You know, I was almost convinced when I was reading this. I was like, yeah, that's true. So should we commit to a thorough spatial turn? What would that mean? Or should we just, well, again, should we just, it's not a right way to put this, but should we actually commit to more relational kind of understanding and really going with the diversity of voices that we meet and trying to move away from Western forms of dominant knowledge production?
Wow, can I jump in there, Nicole? Is that?
Absolutely, you can.
Yeah,
Please
look,
do.
It's a great question, Nick, and you're so right to identify the tension, because of course we could have done, you know, as someone who has that critical orientation to these kinds of turns, I could be doing other kind of work. I could be standing to one side and saying that all these kinds of turns are just these tricks of knowledge production, which continue to entertain and innovate and develop academic careers, while scholars of the global north continue to bypass Indigenous and local peoples as they develop their careers. So, you know, I could easily write that kind of highly critical piece, but to me that feels a little bit of, what's the expression, throwing stones when you live in glass houses. And it also feels a little bit too totalizing, because as I said before, there are clearly things about the spatial turn that do something different, that bring us closer to peoples, that make us think about where research is being done and about what kind of particular relations circulate in those sites. So I think inhabiting the tension of engaging with the enterprise of the spatial turn while also maintaining a critical eye to it is the best place to be. It's a productive place to be. It's a constructive place to be too, because we're trying to contribute and move things forward without trying to leap beyond ourselves. This is also one of the tricks I think we sometimes we try when we attempt to engage with diversity or difference, is to leap beyond our own premises and our own knowledge frameworks, only then to realize that we're probably reproducing them in ways that we don't anticipate. So I think try to be explicit about where we're coming from and the problems of that gives us a better purchase for engaging across different. So in my piece, for example, I talk about why the question of space and place emerge in 20th century European philosophy as something that needs to be accounted for. And one of the reasons that happens in very broad brush terms is because we've had this focus on the abstract knowing subject, the ungrounded subject, that a lot of other peoples around the globe simply don't have in their knowledge system. So then we circle back around and we now have this spatial turn to address this gap in our knowledge, which other people, certainly the Aboriginal Australian people I engage with, don't have, because they in fact center place and space. So, and then I'm just using that to say, when we do the spatial turn ourselves, let's try to make it a more thorough spatial turn, to pick up your terminology, because if we do that, then we'll have a way of engaging with people which doesn't just reproduce that abstract knower of social science, the abstract knowing subject, but instead finds ways to engage with people both on their terms and in ways that put the terms of their knowledge and their ways of doing political order and peace building and so on in exchange with the ways of the researcher. And that's the productive space to be in, because the world is globalized and the institutional forms that went out for Europe are now operating around the world, and you've got to engage with donors and partners and so on and so forth. So I think that's inhabiting the tension is precisely the right space to be. And you mentioned this word relationality or the relational. I think I think this goes together very well with the idea of emplacement, because you can make a spatial turn and keep yourself abstract or aloof or ungrounded. That's the sort of thing we do all the time in social science. But if you turn that to emplacement, then you invariably get put into relationship, even if you're doing work from your office in the global north, you're put into relation with, how does this type of institution, this type of building emerge? What's the relations that generate this form of knowledge production? And if you're out in the field, well, then you're very much grounded in a different, uncomfortable set of relations. And if you are prepared to inhabit those rather than take comfort from the abstractions that authorize you from the global north, well, then you'll be in a really productive space of engagement. And I think of advancing the spatial turn by making it a far more emplaced and relational spatial turn.
Yes.
That's a great answer. I have to say, really good answer.
It's a really good answer. I think I have a much simpler answer. I mean, it's exactly the same as what Morgan was saying, but just, from my perspective too, the idea is to reflect on to create space for us to reflect on our emplacement as those who are producing knowledge. So, it's not only the emplacement of others, but the emplacement of ourselves. It's not only the emplacement of the people we're I don't want to say observing in the field, but that we're working with when we're developing these ideas, but also, our own emplacement too. So I think that's how that's how I resolve that tension in my own mind, Nick. And I think Morgan did some really amazing work in thinking that through. And we're actually, where this will go in the future is another small article where we're probably going to develop those ideas a little further. So, it's been a really productive collaboration in terms of what we've achieved and where we want to go next.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Annika, feel free also to jump in the fray and, just let me know if you do want to, ask a question or follow-up question, or if you have anything you would like to add. But linked to that, I think there's a nice little kind of follow-up question that would emerge from this is, I think one of the also kind of selling point of the special issue is that I think every single piece is also dealing with the emancipatory potential of the spatial turn, right? And I think, for instance, Morgan, in your piece, the potential that this potential will be unlocked if actors can grasp in the broader sense, but can grasp the relational emplacement of the knowing subject and the varied ways in which a place configures the social political order, And this is also a concern that is present in many contributions, including yours, Nicole. So I think collectively you point to this importance of interacting with the diverse people, not simply, and this is very important, as research partners, but also as sophisticated theoreticians of space and place. I really found that very, very interesting and a really nice contribution. And so this leap here is really of interest to me. It's something I've been struggling with. So that you know, there's been a growing literature, for instance, on the co-production of knowledge, right? That everyone knows, and probably there's been a few pieces in cooperation and conflict on the theme. And so the importance of collaborative ways of doing research, non-extractive research processes, for instance, right? But we also know, sadly enough, that this has remained, you know, discourse more than practice. You know, everywhere we go, we notice the same kind of extractive methods of doing research happening around us, if not by us to a certain extent, but, you know, again, throwing rocks in the house of, you know, a house of glass, as Morgan was saying, as, you know, so of course, everyone, no one is perfect, but still we see the same extractive kind of ways. So can you let us know how we can do this leap that you're suggesting towards emancipation, and how can we avoid, from maybe anecdotes of the ways that you've seen research, or you're thinking about research, but how can we look at the spatial turn the way that you are suggesting to us without falling to the same old extractive ways of doing research?
Brilliant question, Nick. I'm so fascinated by the whole notion of the co-production of knowledge and co-construction of knowledge. And I think by looking at this emplacement, it becomes more realistic and more emancipatory, as you point out. And I think that is a valuable contribution of this special issue, that it equals out, or at least have the ambition to equals out relationships in research to an extent that few people doing fieldwork actually manage to do. So that is one of the things that I'm taking on board for my own future fieldwork. So sorry, Nicole, please.
Well, I was just going to say, because we just had a conference here in Australia, and I actually gave a really sort of autoethnographic paper at the recent OSIS conference, Nick, where I think I've been grappling with a lot of these really big questions over the past year, and particularly with, we see a lot of, what can I say, activism in the academy at the moment, where, we really have to come to grips with who we are as scholars, and, our position and our power for representation. So, one of the things that COVID-19 has allowed me to do is the space to reflect a lot more on what it means to do fieldwork, because I haven't been able to do fieldwork, right? So I've been thinking more about what's at stake when I do fieldwork, and, where am I in that process, and how do I, because to be frank with you, I would say that for as much as we try not to be extractive, we are inevitably, I think we just are, and we have to try and minimize that as much as possible. But I do think it is, I as a field worker I try to build trusting relationships. I try to be there when people ask me to come back. I revisit countries, it's not, I go in, I hope not, I'm not seen like that, to go in, parachute, get my bank of data and leave and never be seen again. I try not to operate like that. But I do think, when you come from outside with the security of the beautiful institution I work in, the people I work with don't have that security. And I can try to build opportunities for those people, but I'm not, I don't have the resources to do it for everyone. So, I'm being very honest here. This is a reality of doing this kind of work. And I think we shouldn't blind ourselves to the fact that there are enormous power differentials. But having said that, I have been thinking about, well, what can I do? And I think in part, the work on space has helped me think through this, because it made me sort of really think about the scale at which I work and the scale at which I'm doing the analysis, and and the kinds of politics that I would like to make a little bit more known and a little bit more valued, and to try and undo this sort of hegemony of scale. I will be quite frank, in feminist international relations, you know, where the global scale, again, is the most powerful, the most important. If you're doing the large end study where you bring together, you know, observations for 35 countries, you get a lot more citations than someone who does, you know, the grounded field work of the local in Solomon Islands. And I'm completely fine with that. But I guess what I'm more and more, what I want to do with my work is say, there are things that can be seen at the smaller scale, at the scale of the communal, the village, the household, the body, that can't be seen at the global scale, and they are no less important. And I think that, you know, I want to amplify understanding of why that scale is important. So that's something the way, you know, that I feel. I'm not answering the question about emancipation, maybe, but I am answering the question about, you know, I can't even remember what the question was now, Nick.
But you're answering it about extractive strategies of research.
That's right,
but,
and the position, you know, and the power dynamics, and you know what's at stake when we do this kind of work. So that's kind of how I'm squaring the tension that is also part of that work, is to make more space to hear the words and the voice of, you know, not just to sort of recast it in my own language, but actually to capture the narrative as it is raw in that work. That's something also that I really want to do, and to push back when reviewers say there's too much citation of local actors, and say, actually, they're the voice, you know, they're the voice, and that voice matters. Yeah,
and that's the strength of the special issue. You can see this definitely, you know, this kind of engagement with the local voices and giving pride of place to the local voices. I think it's really powerful.
I just add something quickly there. Part of what Annika's referring to too is these really, and you as well, Nick, is these really big, challenging ethical issues in social sciences. We're rethinking how we go about knowing. But I also, and we've got to continue to work on that for sure, but I also think we can dial back from that a long way to quite practical matters when we're thinking about the emancipatory potential of the kind of work we do. And I might illustrate this just with an example from the special issue. If you think about local traditional peoples who move from their rural homelands to the cities, the standard narrative we have about that is, here are people on the way to secularization, to being consumers and being workers, and we have a dominant narrative in political science and social science that this is a kind of a modernizing transformation of people where traditional customary beliefs and practices and so on get swept away as they're on the way to rational utilitarian consuming subjects, something along those lines. But what the piece by Charlie Hunt and Volker Berger points out is that they document this phenomenon they call traveling traditions, where you see actors in urban conglomerations, in slums and other parts of major cities at two countries in the, that they take Vanuatu and Sierra Leone, I think, and they show how people bring their traditions with them and repurpose them in these new sites. And the way they repurpose them is inflected by those sites, but it brings this customary practices with them. So I would say, if you're looking, if we as researchers are looking for the emancipatory potential of what we can do, we could quite simply begin by just being willing to be surprised and to put aside our dominant stories about what's happening in social and political change. And if you do that, they're key ingredients for that research that Charlie and Volker have done in that case. They noticed something there that others hadn't been noticing, because they were operating with a level of respect and humility and engagement that enabled them to say, well, this doesn't, I don't know what was going on in their heads, but it doesn't fit with the dominant story, but that allows them to see what is going on and to document it and draw it out. And I think, I know it's a small example, but there you've got a kind of emancipatory, there's an emancipatory bit of practice in there. Sure, it's not large scale and so on, but it is something about people's self-determination, about how they organize their affairs and manage their conflicts and organize peace and order in their realm.
No, that's a powerful example. And also found that this very useful. And it's a good example of how researchers can interact with the local or diverse people on their own, in their own way, right? On their own terms, not imposing categories in a very Bourdieuian way, in a sense, but really taking the concepts as they flow. So I think it's a really good point, Morgan. I know that I've already abused my time as I'm looking at Annika, but I have one final question. It's kind of an open question, I guess, more open than. But I would like, as a closing remark, just to ask you to highlight maybe the contribution of one specific article in the special issue that stands out for you. Maybe it's because since the publication of the special issue, there's been changes on the ground or other kind of other events that you found useful. Maybe just because you think that there's something very interesting and specific that you would like to highlight. And I know it's not about picking favorites, right? I'm conscious that this amounts to be picking which child we prefer or something like that, and we all love them equal, right? Obviously, we know that, but I'm just thinking if you can just highlight one specific contribution for the listeners at home, who might be interesting in getting into a little bit more depth the special issue. Which one would that be?
Well, I'll just jump in quickly and say that I think for its kind of innovation and flipping the analysis a little bit, I think Joanne Wallace's contribution on the Emplaced Security of peace builders is a really interesting one. So sort of, getting at the ethnographic experience, not of, the native peoples, but actually of those who intervene is a really interesting and sort of innovative take on emplacement. So I would really recommend everybody have a read of that one, just to confuse what you think you might know about peace building and space and place, and changing the narrative slightly.
Thanks, Nick. I find it hard. I think I might just avoid it by saying I love them all, as you put it. I've already referred to a couple of them for you. Damien's piece. Though if I am pushed, I do have ringing in my head just a little contribution from Anne Brown. One of the things she highlights in her piece is the dangers of this process of reification, which we get into in it's sort of a stock and trade of social science knowledge production, actually. And Anne's got a nice little phrase which she just says, reification is the process of mistaking categories, our categories that we use, for entities in the world. And again, I think that's a nice reminder of how we can allow ourselves to be surprised in the field by holding our categories skeptically or lightly to be able to engage differently with people. But I love them all, as I said.
Well,
He loves all his children equally.
I think you were very diplomatic here, all of you. As an editor of Cooperation and Conflict, I would say that I think that people should start with the brilliant introduction written by Nicole and Morgan. For one reason, it's open access, so it's available to all, but also because it sets the scene very nicely for thinking about space and place in the spatial turn, and gives you a heads up of what is coming in the following articles. So it's a very well crafted introduction, I think. So that would be my pick to start off with.
That's very diplomatic of you, very polite of you.
Also very diplomatic, right? Well, I think this has been most stimulating. It has provided so much food for thought and inspiration for my own research, but I think also for a number of Cooperation and Conflicts readers and now viewers. And I want to thank you so much for your willingness to contribute to this new initiative. And thank you to Nick for these brilliant questions, really triggering your mind, thinking about space and place and the spatial turn and knowledge production in so many different ways that I will have to revisit this CoCo conversations to really think about it, and the brilliant answers provided by Nicole and Morgan. You have so much wisdom. I'm so impressed. I'm really gonna listen to this again and again to make sure that I don't miss out on anything.
Can I say, Annika, thank you so much for supporting our special issue across the period that we proposed it to you, and also helping us through the editorial process. It's really been a great collaboration with you as well. So we really value that. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
No good mama, bye bunging biruan.